The snow was no longer just part of the landscape. It had become an enemy. It fell without pause, covering everything, erasing paths, swallowing footprints, turning the world into a white desert where the only certainty was the cold, a cold that didn't just discomfort, but destroyed. In the middle of that desolate scene stood Napoleon Bonaparte, wrapped in a heavy coat, mounted and silent, observing what remained of an army that months earlier had seemed invincible. He said nothing, but he knew. This was no longer a typical military campaign. This was survival. It had all begun with absolute confidence. Napoleon was not just another general. At that moment, he was the most powerful man in Europe. His victories were fast, precise, almost inevitable. Larger armies had already fallen before him. Kings had been humiliated, empires reshaped. When he decided to invade Russia, there was no doubt in his mind. It would be another victorious campaign, another demonstration of his brilliance. With more than 600,000 men, the so-called Grande Armée crossed borders like an unstoppable force. The sound of marching boots, the shine of weapons, the discipline of the troops, everything pointed toward yet another historic conquest. But Russia did not respond as expected. There was no great battle at the beginning, no decisive confrontation. Instead, the French army advanced through empty lands, abandoned villages, destroyed crops, burned barns. It was as if the country itself was retreating, refusing to fight. Many interpreted that as weakness, but it wasn't. It was strategy. The Russians were sacrificing territory to eliminate any possibility of sustaining the enemy. Every kilometer gained was an illusion, because with it came hunger, exhaustion, and decay. Even so, Napoleon pushed forward. He believed everything would be decided in Moscow. The city was not just a point on the map, it was a symbol. Capturing it would force Russia to surrender. That was how war worked in Europe. Capitals fell, wars ended. But Russia did not follow that logic. When they finally reached Moscow, there was no significant resistance, no final grand battle, no glorious moment to victory. The city was empty, silent, strangely abandoned. That alone was already a warning that something was wrong, but the worst was yet to come. That very night, small fires began to appear across the city. At first, they seemed isolated, manageable, but the wind, always the wind, began to spread the flames with terrifying speed. In a short time, Moscow became an inferno. Fire consumed houses, streets, entire districts. The sky turned red, covered in thick smoke. Napoleon watched it all, unable to act. The city that was supposed to mark his greatest victory was being destroyed before his eyes, and not by an enemy attack, but by the Russians themselves. They had chosen to lose everything rather than surrender. It was not just a military tactic, it was a message. Even then he waited. He waited for the Tsar to negotiate, for peace to be proposed, for the familiar logic of European war to finally prevail. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. Russia simply did not respond. It was as if Napoleon's presence meant nothing, and while he waited, the weather changed. The cold began to intensify, slowly at first, then steadily, until it became unbearable. By the time the decision to retreat was made, it was already too late. The army was no longer the same. What had once been an organized and disciplined force was beginning to collapse. The retreat revealed the true nightmare. The road back was devastated, stripped of resources, without shelter. The cold became more aggressive with each passing day. Soldiers froze while marching. Some simply stopped, unable to continue, and were left behind. No one could help. To stop was to die. Hunger struck with full force. With no supplies left, The men began to eat whatever they could find. Dead horses were quickly torn apart. Leather was boiled in desperate attempts to extract some form of nourishment. There was no discipline anymore, only survival. War was no longer strategic, it had become primitive. And as if that were not enough, the Russians began to attack, not in open battles, but constantly, unpredictably. They appeared suddenly, struck the weakest, and disappeared into the snow. It was relentless pressure, both physical and psychological, offering no rest. Napoleon still led, still gave orders, still tried to maintain some structure, but even he felt the weight of the situation. The man who once seemed to control everything was now reacting, trying to survive something beyond his control. Nature, time, exhaustion. These were enemies no strategy could defeat. The most critical moment came at the crossing of the Berezina River. It was the only escape route, but also the greatest danger. The river was partially frozen, unstable, and Russian forces were closing in. The decision was immediate: build makeshift bridges and cross. Under extreme cold, under constant pressure, engineers worked to their limits. Many died in the process, but they managed to construct fragile structures just strong enough to allow passage. The crossing turned into chaos. Soldiers, civilians, the wounded, all tried to cross at once. Wagons broke apart, men pushed each other, some fell into the icy water and vanished beneath the surface. Panic spread everywhere. At the same time, enemy attacks intensified the pressure. It was a race against time, against the cold, against death itself. Still, part of the army managed to cross, Napoleon among them. But the cost was devastating. Thousands died at that very point. And when it was over, what remained of the Grande Armée was only a shadow of what it had once been. Of the more than 600,000 men who had begun the campaign, only a fraction returned. It was almost total destruction. Napoleon survived, but his image did not. The Russian campaign was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of a myth. Until then, he had been seen as invincible, a strategist above all others. After that winter, the world saw his limits, and perhaps for the first time, Napoleon saw them too. He would fight again. He would try to reclaim his power. But something had changed. Blind confidence had been replaced by something heavier. The memory that not everything can be controlled, that there are forces greater than any army, and that sometimes the greatest defeat does not come from an enemy, but from the choices made at the height of confidence. In that Russian winter, it was not just an army that fell, it was the idea of invincibility. It was proof that even the greatest empires can collapse, and that even the man who once seemed to command the world could be defeated by the cold, by time, and by his own ambition.